Artifacts of trust. Our conference title terms, legal design and contractual forms, are invitingly ambiguous. Contract I take to denote an agreement of exchange between parties of considerations, that is, entities of value, witnessed and enforced by third parties. Yet there is the ontological ambiguity between the structures of contracts and those of their physical instruments, usually surface markings, that display and preserve them for at least the three parties mentioned, as shown in the phrase, tear up a contract. While elaborate records of ancient contracts like this 8-foot folding prenuptial go back to at least dynastic Egypt, the most famous was twice, quote, carved in stone atop Mount Sinai. But when Moses broke the first, he didn't break his people's contract with the divine, which recorded only part of the offerer's terms, by the way, leaving out the consideration, which was to be a treasured people. Besides, Moses had already written a book of them from memory, and over 500 more got listed in the books following Exodus. So when we apply the terms design and or form to contracts, we need to keep clear in which of the two senses. Of course, in these meetings, we're interested in the interactions of the two senses. Usually no contract exists until an enduring physical manifestation does. Thus the recent comment that Johnny Depp, quote, lost $2.5 million deal to reprise his role in the 6th Pirates of the Caribbean. The agreement was verbal, continues the quote, not formally written out into a contract, his agent testified. But in early 2019, it became clear to him that Disney would be, quote, going in a different direction, end of quote. I'll begin with suggestions about form or design in the first sense, of the physical instruments, what I call display artifacts, notably in drawing and other designs on surfaces. Then I'll suggest a philosophically very broad approach to the second sense of contract, as shown in human nature itself, notably through human ontogeny, even human evolution. The latter, very broad argument is based on the most recent science studied during COVID. I'll leave it to others to bring these two senses together, though I'll later remark that in reading about a contract design for this conference, I was struck by recent parallel developments for both senses, perhaps under a common heading, against fine print. Part 1. Contract graphics, using our brains. Using our brains. For example, regarding a contract display, the next speaker, Helena Hapio, has commented on a recent visual turn whereby graphics is increasingly recognized for showing, quote, both the detail and the big picture in contracts. On that theme, I find fascinating, not strictly a contract, but a charter of land transfer from Alfonso VII, King of Castile, to a Benedictine abbot, Vilhelmus, in the year 1150. The graphic takes up more than 40% of the parchment, leading different commentators to say that this artifact must be not the original, but a decorated presentation copy. Next, a close scholar, that it, quote, offers redundancy of information as if the scribe was obsessed with a legalistic desire to clarify, end of quote. But think of Hapio's big picture. With apologies to the scholar, who's a friend of mine, how redundant is this graphic? Its 5 depicted human figures, divided topologically by 3 frames, are not only named above each, but lettered A through D for the text below them. Thus A, Alfonso, as confirmed by the unit B, his 2 sons, Kings Sancho, believe it or not, and Ferdinand, transfers land to Abbot C, witnessed by Count Ponce, or Ponce, D. Taken in with a glance, pictorially, emperor and kings bearing branches point to a central figure, the abbot, who receives with benediction, while a witness stands guard with a sword. In testament to such graphics, beyond decorative embellishment, even those who can't manage the script or the Latin, how can we get this, the gist of this, 900 years later? The two suns are grouped by the shared letter B and also by the frame, and their depictions, very similar, also through the markings that define them, which combine. That's contrasted with images of the emperor and the witness, quite dissimilar and spatially separate in both depiction and in physical marking. Notice that while Alfonso's robe takes a swing out to occlude Ponce, putting him behind, this is not evident with the two suns. Graphic means. It's usual to treat all this in terms of, quote, visualization. But let's remember that according to science, vision is a complex, the combined actions of a number of distinct modules, any of which may be separately recruited for service in graphic displays. For example, according to science, the just mentioned occlusion is the strongest depth cue. We notice its restrained use here. Other examples are the abbot's crosier and Alfonso's occluded throne, as the image stays flat with the text. More stressed in the description I just gave are the often forgotten topological or shape values mentioned: number, order, inclusion, with connectivity and separateness stressed. May be surprising for a medieval manuscript, I hope you noticed. A visual device that's missing is color. As our scholar further informs us, at that time, under French influence, color dropped out in favor of more line, as in the fold renderings, thus a selection of modules. But let's not overdraw the difference between graphic marks and words on 2D surfaces. As we see here, written words and their order occur themselves as inscriptions, design objects. Any copy of a written contract is already a usually visual design object, which, again thanks to Professor Hapio, we find well recognized by David Berman's toward a new format for Canadian legislation regarding typeface, size, spacing, color, etc. Staying in Canada, my son-in-law lets us look at a few pages of his 16-page contract form, clearly laid out. I'll come back to it. I wish we could continue by use of such interesting cases, even from the rich field of medieval manuscripts. Not having space, let's proceed to two general observations. First, from this idea of distinct visual modules as occlusion, my first suggestion for contract display design is to benefit from scientific perception work, which separates vision into a number of modules. For notable example, that analyzes the so-called perspective that everybody thinks about into a concomitance of separable cues, notably the occlusion that we mentioned, foreshortening, diminution, height in the visual field or against the horizon, aerial gradients, bluing, and so forth. Let's add shadow and shine, also human proclivities for edge detection and facial recognition. I suggest that visual designers be acquainted with them separately, these modules, and in their combinations, along with the worldwide history of their ingenious combination. Accordingly, I recommend reversing our cultural habit of thinking of graphic methods as reductions, abstractions from naturalistic rendering, and think of graphics like vision itself as combinations of different cues, modules. It's a palette for our use. My second suggestion, far more general, includes the first. It's due to the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky. It uses his idea of cognitive mediators, which, if I may say, notes that we actively use our brains, giving humans an extent of freedom from nature. An extent, but freedom. Called signs, Vygotsky's mediators are artifacts produced so as partly to shift the work of particular mental systems onto others. Note the modularization, different mental systems. He wrote that mediators allow, quote, humans, by the aid of an extrinsic stimuli, which they've made, to control their behavior from outside, thereby, end of quote, thereby further freeing us from stimulus-response reactions. For example, we offload short-term memory work by putting things in the environment to have various of our senses remind us. Our keys where we're bound to see them, timers on stoves to hear, position of bread maker so you'll smell the bread just before it finishes baking. All mediators. I have made a mediator for myself, which you can't see, but this was part of it. I've chopped up pictures of people and put them together, and that's what I'm looking at. Why? I've put this mediator into my environment, so by looking at it, I have a focus and I have face response, which makes it more natural for me to talk to a bookcase. For me, a recent failed mediator was a large vertical QWERTY layout on a train ticketing machine to help me perform the motor action of punching a series of buttons for, nonsense buttons. But I could hardly manage it visually since, being a writer, my access to the QWERTY pattern is via motor action, which I couldn't perform on that display. Stimuli for the wrong sense mode. Bad feedback for me. Similar Vygotskian signs are Arabic numerals, which, better than Roman, provide marks to make in the environment on which we can perform stepped manual, often graphic procedures to get quick, accurate, confirmable results. Onward to Feynman diagrams, etc. Thus, with sign mediators, our minds actively exploit the aforementioned brain modularity generally, not only the visual, for our own purposes. Why so-called visualization is central in this is simply because in humans, not all creatures, so much of the cortex is given to vision, so the other parts appeal to and borrow from vision quite a lot. Here let's register, however, a misgiving I always have about visualization. People lacking sight or some of its modules also benefit from mediators, certainly, even from graphics. I don't have it here, but the blind also draw and can understand drawings by touch. We should add that environmental vision's modules being closer to those of touch than to those of smell and taste, even hearing, which is very spatial. Diagrams often recruit it. I tried to exploit this in a diagram years ago for students in modern philosophy. Log. It's a 30-60-degree oblique drawing, which avoids the pointless diminution module, adding only a bit of the foreshortening for needed information. Here's an exercise. Ask your students next for Hume's revision of this drawing, this graphic. In another heuristic graphic that I've used, sorry, this one was for a French audience, now for teaching Plato's Menon, the main point is topological, nested inclusion, again with pointing. This is very much on to explain the Platonic dialogue. Socrates is showing Menon how he's teaching the boy. But Plato is showing us Socrates doing that, which is to explain to us the Platonic or Socratic dialogue. And when you do that for students, that's the next frame outward. Our main example here is of linguistic and other graphic signs, what some people would call mixed semiologies, modules from the two. But of course, they don't have to be from language or from visual pictures. Okay, part 2. Against fine print, designing contracts. Let's leave this rich topic of design of legal instruments to others and turn to the second sense of contract design. We might say turn from shell to Dell. Recent examples in graphic contract design are Professor Hapio's of shell oils for point of transfer contracts, whereas we read in the Harvard Business Review that Dell and FedEx had a problem with the nature of contracting itself. It seems that in the 8th year of FedEx's 100-page shipping contract with Dell Computer Hardware, quote, the parties were at a breaking point. Each lacked trust and confidence in the other, yet neither could afford to end the relationship. Dell's cost of switching to another company would be high, and FedEx would have trouble replacing the revenue. A lose-lose scenario. Familiar? The Harvard article generalizes that in negotiations, companies typically go, quote, to an adversarial mindset and transactional approach. They agonize over every conceivable scenario and then try to put everything in black and white, call for lawyers, to try to gain the upper hand. Habits which, quote, foster negative behaviors that undermine the relationship and the contract itself, end of quote. Thus fine print and lawyers, to write them and read them. The article then argues, quote, a totally different kind of arrangement called a formal relational contract that specifies mutual goals and establishes governance structures to keep the parties' expectations aligned, end of quote, since it's designed, quote, to foster trust and collaboration where it's impossible to predict every what-if scenario. This is supposedly a new approach. How well this will work, I don't know. And also, standard contracts, for example, even for small companies like my son-in-law's, already have many sub-clauses. And I did note one I won't show you, 2.6, which is sort of a relational contract clause that they found very helpful. And that is for the builder to have the customer come to the site every once in a while at their request and go over things with them, see how it's going, see what the problems are, etc. Talk together. Still, leading to our second main topic, we notice that the wording for my son-in-law's contract remains singular, third person. Neither we nor us occur on any page. This is the cue for my main point regarding this huge topic, and thus section 3. The human story of we. Back to current science, where according to Michael Tomasello and others, it is the experience of we in 2 developmental stages that actually defines human beings among all other creatures, not intelligence, or bipedalism, etc. As shown in individual development, which we call ontogeny, this comes remarkably early, in babies, usually beginning by what's called the 9-month revolution. We'll come back to that. Then, by around the toddler age of 3, experience moves to the next stage of cultural we, which develops as trust and equality in the course of negotiation, on which is built a sense of fairness and thereby other norms, such as the promissory, are built. Thus are binding agreements with social third parties as witnesses and judges, as reflected in our cultural practices of contract. This unique phenomenon begins by age 3 in humans. To invoke one of our own graphic illustrations, crucial to this event, at both levels, is a triangle of intentionality, with roots in ape consciousness, but fully developed only by humans in a normative manner and based on negotiation. I miss blackboards. That triangle. We begin with an ape intentionality triangle. Perceivers at 2 corners, a common object, say a banana, at the third. But our triangle, the human one, has unique sides. Let's start the human ontogeny story near its beginning with just one side of the triangle. With what's called a proto-conversation normal to human mothers and babies long before babies can understand language. Recalling the topic of graphics, while Colwyn Treverton is one of my heroes of developmental psychology, I'm very disappointed by a much reproduced graphic of his. It's a horror. Unlike Alfonso, it has numbers, but they don't even correspond to a text. So here's an image made 3 years before Mary Bateson coined the term proto-conversation. Probably the best photograph I ever took. Kodak Tri-X. The scene is actively reciprocal, affectionate, also imitative. It is human. It involves not just having but sharing feelings, hence the awareness of another as having feelings and attention. The human version of the attentional triangle appears when both, maintaining that awareness of the other, attend not just to one another, but also to the same object. That is, attend together, typically looking back and forth. For that, the literature seems to me to waste two good words, joint and shared, for the attention. We might use joint for situations when two other awarenesses appear, without loss of the first. Shared seems to imply at least cooperation, for which we might add a curve, as I have here. Thus, it is added to an already huge literature of joint attention, another large literature involving Tomasello and others. It's about what's called mind reading, but caution. Moving from the ontogenic, what concerns us is the phylogenetic split-off of humans from our great ape ancestry. Remarkably, primatologists find chimpanzees and gorillas mentalize quite well. That is, they don't just go by behavior. Moving from the ontogenetic, what concerns us is the phylogenetic split-off of humans from our great ape ancestry. Remarkably, primatologists find that chimpanzees and gorillas mentalize quite well. That is, they don't just go by behavior, but seem to, quote, mind read perceptions, feelings, knowledge, intentions, goals of conspecifics. This begins with gaze following, not just using head turning, but eye turning via their sclera, or the whites of their eyes. Lest this seem just a reflex, controlled experiments show, for example, that a chimp will avoid going for food if it knows that a dominant individual sees, even has seen, that food, and so keeps its own food out of sight, and so forth. They also cooperate, of course. They coordinate in hunting and fighting, including but beyond sympathy with kind and friends, which is maintained by grooming activity. But according to Tomasello's science, the great difference is that chimps' main social motivation in all this seems to be competitive. Never lets up, which, for example, in hunting, uses the others as tools for their own interests. Cooperative, but not really collaborative. Thus, they never share the spoils of group hunts and tend only to help others who might help them. This applies to maternal behavior. 2, rather than working together, they mutually use one another for their own gains. Sound familiar? However, by about 400,000 years ago, the Homo species shifted to what's called obligate, active collaboration in foraging, and evolution selected for, quote, cooperatively competent and motivated individuals. Thereby, a psychology of simultaneous sharedness and individuality, keeping both, very tricky, keeping self-awareness while adopting joint agency, our first sense of we, that even a small child has. The implications of this new evolutionary situation are complex. But let's just note that the obligate aspect of it, each playing a part, in early childhood produces a sense of roles, the importance of games. Thereby, conceptually, individuals are separated from their roles. They might exchange roles, each of which has mutually known and impartial standards of performance. Thereby, individuals gain a kind of equality and can normatively evaluate themselves, as well as others, for their performance of this new objective thing, a role. You're not supposed to do that. Oh, I'm supposed to do this now. Okay. That's age 3, they say. Thus, the we sense is taken in as part of the I sense. That's greatly missed, I think, in a lot of philosophy. But let's put off this higher cultural sense of we and go back to the triangle at the basic level in infancy, about 9 months. Much has been written about the ontogenesis of the first 9-month triangle. How does it emerge? In brief, for our species, A sense of real, objective world is formed by interaction, indeed triangulation with others, on common entities. A famous early stage of this is our friend pointing, not just as a warning or demand, but for shared information, which only humans do, and in the first year, between 9 months and 1 year. Pointing at least implies accepting literally different points of view, that there is a distinct perceiver, say parent, whose perspective on the same world is somewhat different from one's own. That's the point of pointing. Recall the human proto-conversation line that I drew earlier. Current science holds that this primal double take in humans develops into an empathetic version of our diagram's first line. Empathy, distinct from apes' so-called mind reading, means that beyond pointing's assuming another perspective, also imagining, perceiving from that perspective while maintaining your own perspective. This allows us to triangulate on that third vertex, the object. To this, Tomasello adds, quote, an individual cannot come to this way of understanding things either by inventing a clever theory of mind, or by simulating another's experience, which apes do. Rather, to coordinate perspectives and so understand the distinction between subjective and objective, an individual must triangulate on a shared situation simultaneously with another individual. In joint attentional interactions, partners are constantly attempting to align their goals and attention. He calls this alignment negotiation. Imagining another's mental state, so-called mind reading, isn't sufficient for this, which is why other apes can't do it. They don't triangulate empathetically. As I'd put it, it's like having a second eye, but not negotiating with the other to get stereo depth vision. How can you explain to somebody who doesn't have two eyes what the experience of stereo is? How do you explain to someone who doesn't understand we what that experience is and how it's different from I and another I? For evolution, this empathy background has the practical advantage of joint intentionality broadly, in everyday terms. Think of what's involved in carrying bulky objects together. The Chinese gung-ho literally means all together. Tomasello's phylogenetic argument is that our whole cascade of shared agencies came about from a single psychological event, appearance of the basic sense of we at about age 1, ontogenetically. Leave it to philosophers to question how collective intention is possible, since the only intention you can have is your own, and collective intentionality is more than an aggregate of such singulars. Maybe the we intentionality is a psychological illusion. No matter, its appearance made a huge defining difference to evolution. There's a like difference in ontogeny with extreme autism as a control situation, children who just never get to we. To end with our topic of contracts, let's return to the higher cultural level of we, the second one, which mobile and now weaned children reach by the age of 3. This is collective intentionality for Tomasello. Quote, the group-minded motivation to affiliate and care for the social group by respecting and conforming to its conventions and norms under the pressure of obligation, quote, and we should add, for better or worse. With this comes the sense of fairness, also of guilt, and social self-regulation. Thereby, for better or worse, culture. Compare this finally with the language of the new so-called formal relational contracts. Quote, aligned to foster trust and collaboration. Its theorists mean the human we, the sense of doing things together with others, as opposed to ape competition with cooperation only as use of others for singular purposes. Not to be naive, we well know that the ape motive remains strong in us. Still, here is my meme for the relational contract idea. I suggest that they use the simple term we contracts.